there is no secular civilization possible, and that's because civilization is intrinsically a spiritual activity. The art you're going to get is TikTok videos. Do you want that to be the legacy of our civilization, or do you want something better? And I think it's not, it takes 5 minutes to produce something better. So why are we not doing it? It is, of course, one of the great modern heresies that art has anything to do with self-expression. The self is only of interest insofar as it participates in something greater than itself. So works of art are not about ourselves, but about the thing that we make. But to make well, we have to master craft. We have to master the traditions of making that our ancestors worked pretty hard to develop if we're going to make anything good ourselves.
Today on the channel, I am joined by James Matthew Wilson, considered by many, including me, as one of the greatest living American poets and writers. You are a scholar, founder of a master program at the University of St. Thomas. You are the poetry editor of Modern Age, a conservative magazine, and you are a Catholic. James Matthew Wilson, thank you for coming on the channel.
What a delight to be with you.
Well, first of all, could you tell us a bit about your journey of faith? Are you a cradle Catholic or a convert?
That's a very good question, because if you look at the annals of American Catholic literary history, most of the great Catholic authors in the United States have been converts to the faith. There are only a handful of substantial exceptions. And if I can be counted in those numbers, I'm certainly an exception. I was born into a long-standing Catholic family going back as far as we know into the depths of the past in Bavaria.
So in this interview, I'd like to quote several of your articles before talking about your poetry. In 2018, for the Catholic Thing, you wrote a brilliant article on being Catholic modern, in which you praise the counter-cultural bravery of the Church from the syllabus of errors onward, and you deplore the lack of provocative ambitiousness of most recent predications. Could you tell us what Catholics should seek and beware in counterculturalism?
Well, that's a very apt question at the moment, because there are aspects of contemporary Catholic culture that have gained back some of the pick or audaciousness that I was describing in that article of years ago. But it's maybe wise to recall what occasioned that article, which was a very interesting book called Catholic Modern by an American historian that tried to depict 20th century Catholic thought, especially on the continent, in terms of whether it, and this is putting it a little bit crudely, but whether it tended to fear communism more or fear fascism more. And so Jacques Maritain is a leading figure in that book, for instance, as one of those who was stricken more with fear of fascism than of communism. And one of the sort of subplots of the story Chappelle tells us is that after the Second World War, there's a marked, I think one can describe it so, there's a marked taming of the spiritedness of Catholic social thought. And I suppose we see this in, say, a mid-century or second half mid-century social encyclical like Populorum Progressio, where it sounds as if the church is more or less calling simply for the modern welfare state, with a spiritual dimension added in to make sure that it's an integral humanism. So that contrasts markedly its sort of desire to lightly christen what had by that point emerged as a mostly secular modern European social order. That contrasts markedly with some of the bolder moments in Catholic social thought from the early 20th century, including examples out of Ireland and Portugal and Spain and the other and even early 20th century Italy, where there were efforts to conceive of a distinctly Catholic spirit of politics. Now, I want to say quickly that that there are some excuses for the tameness of later Catholic thought, and there are also some warnings about the spiritedness of early 20th century Catholic thought. First of all, at the turn of the 20th century, the Catholic Church had had experienced so many political defeats in the 19th century that a lot of its boldest talk was effectively confined to paper. And then, second of all, it is the case that that part of that the failure in 20th century Catholic thought to retain a certain audaciousness was because too many of its thinkers were willing to compromise either with communism or fascism. But I think we're at a moment now, a genuinely post-liberal moment, where a vacuum has opened up in the political life of the West, and it's a time for bold thinking to envision what kind of democratic politics, what kind of Republican politics can come out of the emergence of this new era that has so many troubles that have so far been largely unanswered and insufficiently addressed.
And Jacques Maritain summarized this vacuum, as you say, in this quote: "A renewal of the social order on Christian lines will be a work of sanctity, or it will not occur at all." This is very relevant today.
I think I was deeply moved this last Easter. I was sitting at the desk where I'm sitting now, writing what, on balance, was a very pessimistic poem called Good Friday. And and as I approached the end of the poem, I realized that it would be a dated poem if it ended in a state of doubt or pessimism. And so I won't share the ending with you because it's not going to be published for another few months. But the ending takes a slight turn that the reader won't anticipate. And one of the reasons for that is I was conscious that as I was writing this poem, that was a poem about decline and doubt, that 10,000 people were being baptized in Paris that Easter. That there's been a great resurgence of not the superficial political use of religion, but a great resurgence of actual sincere and world transcending historical faith in a lot of pockets of the world. And it's to those places we have to look for the future of the faith, sources of renewal that are sincere and profound, and that recognize something that we sometimes forget, that John Paul II, as the late philosopher Alistair MacIntyre puts it, John Paul II says in Splendor Veritas that that human beings are culture transcending creatures. And if anybody has read the late Pope Francis's Laudato Si, one of the few notes of hopefulness in that fairly bleak assessment of the contemporary world is that human beings are ordered, in Maritain words, to the transcendentals, to truth, goodness, and beauty. And that's a first signature of our capacity to transcend history. And so what that means that, contrary to a very typical American way of thinking, that history proceeds along inevitable lines and that it runs in a very certain direction. In fact, there is nothing determined about the present and nothing determined about the future of history, because history is not in itself God's providence. And so history is always open to being turned by those who are willing to, with their souls, in a sense, step out of history and live for the eternal.
And one significant factor in this coming history will be the real training of the mind to fight against ignorance. In 27 for The Observer, you wrote that the greater numbers of young Catholics get their only exposure to the life of the Church at a weekly guitar mass. They attend public schools where they are told everything they need to know is taught in its classrooms. They watch their daily glut of television where they see that everything they desire can be bought somewhere. Those who go on to attend a Catholic university are likely to receive a couple semesters of theology and perhaps a couple more of philosophy. This gives them an understanding of their church slightly inferior to that which their grandparents got through the Baltimore Catechism by the fifth grade. So your work as a scholar is seeking to balance this ignorance by real, authentic, traditional training of the mind. Could you tell us about that?
I hope we can call it an aphorism of mine, is that we are a part of a remedial generation. We're a remedial generation insofar as if you're someone like me who came into a more intellectually robust and spiritually dynamic Catholicism in early adulthood, you had to spend the next 20 or my goodness, that essay that you're referring to is almost 20 years old now. You have to spend the next 2 decades after that appears re-educating yourself and trying to recover much of the wisdom that has been lost, and hopefully even go a bit deeper than our grandparents did. But so I will say to teachers again that we're a remedial generation because teachers have a very special role in the rebirth of what's called in the United States classical or Catholic liberal education, because they're often performing a remedial role on themselves. They have to educate themselves more deeply than they were in school in order to educate the children in these schools. They have to educate the parents of these children because those parents often come to these schools seeking a better, more spiritually profound and intellectually, again, audacious education for their children, even though they don't quite understand it. It's only the children of the present who will never have to be remediated because only they will have grown up from birth knowing the good things, the true things, and the beautiful things. I'll say one quick anecdote about that. Almost 20 years ago, not too long after I wrote that essay, I was at a park and a large van pulled up with 9 or 10 children inside. They all got out and started playing on the playground, including a sort of mopey teenager right next to, who was sitting on the swings next to my young daughter Olivia as I was pushing her. And we started talking, and it turns out this boy was the oldest child of the father of this family, who was a great philosopher of Thomas, scholar of Thomas Aquinas, whom I had cited in my own work. And so we met by coincidence and began talking. But I've never forgotten one of the things that boy said as we were talking about education. He was sitting there on the swing like a typical teenager, very mopey, and he said, "You're never too young to read Plato." And I've taken that to my heart, and I think the young people of our day just have to remember you're never too young to read Plato. You're never too young to recover the great tradition.
That's very true. It's quite a challenge, though.
Hmm.
I'd like to come back on a quote from this article. You write that this generalized ignorance leads people to believe that everything they desire can be bought somewhere. This is a very serious perversion of human desire, which is naturally oriented towards God and heaven. If this desire believes it is satisfied with such terrestrial substitutes, it's getting very serious. But most of the time, I think we witness that this supernatural desire remains unsatisfied. And therefore the quest is not quite over. Do you agree that it's what we generally witness in this deeply unhappy and uprooted generation?
Not all my words are going to age well, and I think those words from 2007 were in some respects directed at a very different age from the one we're living in now.
Mm.
I think everyone has realized across the political spectrum that a mere consumer society is a vapid one. The great misfortune is that those who discovered it early enough, or quite early on, were those who had no genuine, authentic, and transcendent alternative ever offered to them. And so we see the horrifying religion of politics, or political religions, as Eric Voegelin called it, emerging on the left in our age, just as it did nearly a century ago in the early days of communism and the Cold War. And so we've seen this played out time and again, from in the United States in the quasi-religious political riots of the year 2020, and even just yesterday in the assassination of one of our political pundits, Charlie Kirk. Um, these are these actions are often psychopathic and incoherent, but they are also religious. They are um, the craving of the spirit for a kind of absolute that politics alone cannot deliver. The reason I think that my words in 2007 haven't aged terribly well is not so much because of that, but because, thanks be to God, that others have awakened to an authentic sense of the transcendent in a way that 18 years ago I would have thought certainly possible, but not likely to occur during my lifetime.
And there is also this quest for diversity, and you also write about that. I'd like to quote your piece about holy eccentricity, as you call it, which I like very much. Saint Francis wore a tonsure, other saints wore hair shirts, Chesterton wore a cape and sabre, Saint Padre Pio wore the wounds of Christ, and John Paul II the scars from a bullet. I do not try to recommend such accoutrements, but rather than celebrating the diversity of what we listen to, wear, eat, smoke, or copulate with, all the while we continue living lives thoughtless, identical, and efficient. We might do better to seek after those higher goods that inevitably make the human wheel spin a little wobbly. This is a very important piece of advice today. Could you explain what led you to write that?
I think that that's ever ancient, ever new advice, frankly. The advice, the call to holiness and to the slight eccentricity of the saints, for sure. Uh, uh, but I think it would speak today a little different than it did back then. Uh, I would put it this way. So I was primarily educated and going through my early formation as a man and as an intellectual and scholar in during the age of Bill Clinton and the end of the 20th century, the aftermath of the Cold War. And I think that there was a sense that the philosopher Francis Fukuyama might have actually had something plausible in mind when he said that spoke of the end of history and the last man, that the sort of the last man phenomenon that Nietzsche described of a bourgeoisie so mediocre and bland and beige that they were incapable of anything heroic or even especially cowardly or dastardly, I should say. Um, that seemed very plausible, but I'll show you a book cover of mine. This is my second book of poems called The Hanging God. And the final poem, this book was published in 2018. Most of the poems were composed between 2010 and
Mm.
2018. And the final poem uh, in that book is called Autumn Road. And it takes place in October before the American presidential election of 2016. And it speaks just of those thoughts that I once had that our age was a flattened out and beige and banal one, a place of pleasant and complacent consumers, and no one being capable of genuine heroism, or for that matter, genuine villainy. But even there, I say I see on the horizon an age that's actually going to be one of fire, where good and evil will be in open conflict, and the language of friends and enemies that we often leave behind us on the school play yard, in fact, is will be apt once again. And I think we've seen that. So those words that you quote now, I think, need to be spoken not to people who are sort of idling in grand somnolence, their spirits and souls slumbering somewhere beneath a pile of cash or petty consumer goods. I think in our day, everyone is alert to the sort of ambient demonic nature of the age where we're being continuously subjected to radical stimuli from social media and the internet and all of that, and we're being continuously inundated with the temptation to surrender our souls to some imminent cause, but we're also, I think, at a moment where people are awakening to the authentic. and the possibility of of embracing the cross. I'll say one more word about that. As I mentioned earlier, I mentioned Jacques Maritain earlier, and I'm a great admirer of Jacques Maritain in many, many ways. When I read his wife Raisa's beautiful memoirs, Les Grandes Amitiés, um, she speaks there of a Thomist generation, of a whole age of people who who recovered from the banal somnolence of the Sorbonne education and positivism and stadialism, etc., and rediscovered being and God as being itself. I'm sure she was correct to describe that change, historical change in those terms. And I know that that change had a great and nourishing effect both in France for a time and later in the United States, where Maritain's influence remains to this day very, very powerful. Um, but the people she's talking about as a generation Thomiste uh, was very different in terms of its demographic structure from what we're seeing now. Now we're seeing a very mass and demotic and everyday transformation of things that that probably is greater in breadth and span than the conversion of a handful of Parisian intellectuals that she was describing.
I am also, you mentioned poetry. I am very sensible to your contribution to the culture of poetry, to the culture of beauty, which has always been promoted by the Catholic Church. Could you comment on this ever so important Christian challenge in the cultural war, which seems so far from what the world has to offer?
Uh, for sure. So the complexity of commenting on this is that there are things that that the church and we Catholics have specifically to contribute, but there are also aspects of it that that don't fit neatly into the discussion of the faith, though they certainly can be informed by it. So here's what I mean by that. As a poet and as a poet, uh, one of my aims has been to recover the great tradition of English verse practice. As you probably know, one of the great influences of French thought on the English language was the entrance of vers libre or free verse into English poetry, which even early on, even its exponents, such as T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, realized was at best a mixed bag and a more than ambivalent or ambiguous development. In the United States and in England, when free verse first entered in, it was sort of a minor contribution to the art, and it helped in some ways innovate and develop the art. But for the most part, poets continued uh, also practicing traditional versification, the use of meter, the use of rhyme. It's only in the 60s generation, with the advent of the beatniks in California, that suddenly everything was cast into the sea and and poetry became a very banal kind of holding forth in various formless idioms. And so a lot of us have, over the last two generations, have sought to recover what was only recently lost, really, again, in the 50s and 60s, especially the 60s, and then continuing into the 70s. And so one of my great causes has been just to rededicate myself to practicing making a good poem that anyone would recognize as a poem. They can
Mm.
hear the meter, they can hear the rhythm being shaped for music, they can hear the rhyme, but to do so in the same way that every artist in every generation has to use these conventions, these traditions that make poetry possible. For every art form would be mute if it weren't for the conventions that are its effectively its toolbox, its set of tools. Um, to use these tools in a way that will be explicitly contemporary, that will give representation to the modern age and to its particular problems and peculiarities, its modes of expression, the furniture of the age, uh, the dramas and the scenarios and the stories that shape it, so that so that as every great artistic age has, the tools and techniques of the past make possible something that's authentically new. but also something that even Homer would recognize as being a poem.
Let me quote your great piece, your poem published in 2020, The River of the Immaculate Conception. The northern march of missions halted here, exhausted, foiled, but sure that come not chasing gold cities, but to build of prayer and clay. So not only is this a Catholic work of art, but it is also deeply American. You're telling the story of the Catholic faith in America. Why did it seem important to you to go back to these roots?
Oh gosh, thank you for that. Yeah, so I've got that book here too, The River of the
Yeah.
Immaculate Conception. It's just a short book, a single long poem in 7 parts.
Mm.
And uh, there are several reasons I wrote that. The most immediate occasion was that the composer Frank LaRocca had been commissioned to compose a mass for the dual feasts of the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, and all of the Americas are consecrated to the Immaculate Conception, and also for the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the first great Marian apparition, and also, sorry, the first modern Marian apparition, and the first modern Marian apparition in the Americas. And so his music, it's a mass setting, um, has is sung in Latin, English, Spanish, and Nahuatl, the Aztec language, and it celebrates the the presence of the Catholic faith on the American continents. So I was invited to the premiere of this mass at St. Mary's Cathedral in San Francisco, and was asked to just write a poem in response to it. But by the time I arrived for mass that day, I you might say my head was thick with ghosts, because I realized that I'd been thinking about the poem that was going to come out of this mass for 20 years or more. I was recalling my youth in here in central Michigan, where I live, in East Lansing, Michigan, being educated in a Catholic school where our history lessons about our native terrain, the state of Michigan, were specifically focused on the presence of Catholics here. And you may say, well, uh, how did Catholics get to Michigan in the early days of the Americas? Well, it's you French people that, of course, brought them here, because the great Jesuit missionaries came down the St. Lawrence Seaway in their canoes and set up um, missions all around the Great Lakes in Michigan. And so many of our place names are uh, named with French names. Just to give one example, the largest city in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan is Marquette, Michigan. And Father Marquette, if you know Saint Marquette, he actually died on the shores of Lake Michigan, just about an hour from where I'm sitting right now.
Mm.
So uh, you might say, well, how significant is this historically to a large and great, and in many ways powerful country like the United States, whose history is largely talked about Anglo-Atlantic, uh, in terms of the Anglo-Atlantic. Well, it's incredibly important, because history is not up to us. History is shaped not by us, but by the hand of God. And if you enter into thinking about the Americas in that light, you realize that far more significant than the birth of a Revolutionary War general or a first president or many presidents was that uh, in the early 16th century, the first mass was said on the coast of Florida by Spanish missionaries. And again, that much of the upper part of the United States and Canada were shaped by the presence of early French missionaries, uh, bringing about a new contact between the native peoples and and the Christian faith through these European emissaries, and making possible a new civilization. And so, in the poem "The River of the Immaculate Conception," I wanted to document specifically how the presence of these often solitary, often doomed missionaries going out into the wilderness have in fact shaped an entire civilization. The title of the poem, "The River of the Immaculate Conception," comes from Father Marquette himself. For when Father Marquette, in his canoe, slipped into the Mississippi River, the great central river of the United States that is like a like the fall of a woman's hair down the entire back of the continent. Um, he immediately consecrated it to the Immaculate Conception. He renamed it the River of the Immaculate Conception. And I think that though that's not the name we use for it, it is a name that has a certain permanence to it, because from that moment on, that bit of terrain is consecrated to God. It becomes part of God's providence in a new and distinct way. And it's just one of the beauties of growing up as a Catholic in the United States and in the Americas, that we can hardly go anyplace without seeing in the terrain, in the names of the places, of our great cities and small towns and rivers, that we can hardly go anyplace and not uh, detect the fingerprints and the footprints of the prayers and the sacraments that have come into those places and quietly shaped them through the centuries. This is the history I wanted us all to remember and, in fact, to live with, because it's not a merely historical phenomenon. It's the life of the church today.
And this poem was commissioned by the Benedict XVI Institute. You wrote this poem as a gift to the church. Can you tell us about this great tradition of patronage and commissions in the Catholic Church, so deeply related to that culture of beauty that we were talking about?
Yes, so it's one of the sort of secondary questions every artist has to have always rattling around in the back of his thought, which is what are the extrinsic conditions that make possible a flourishing art culture? And some of that is purely spontaneous. It would be the life of the market. I think, for instance, of the age of Shakespeare, where Shakespeare and his contemporaries were continuously vying with one another and competing against one another and trying to and at such a rapid rate of development, it boggles the mind. We're continuously competing against each other to show each other what the medium of poetry, of dramatic verse, could do. They were um, they were constantly discovering something new to do, and that was just in the sort of spontaneous competition they had with one another, while they were trying to please an audience that was, for the most part, more inclined to go watch a handful of dogs try to fight a bear lashed to a pillar, bear baiting as it was called. And so they had to be entertained and drawn into the theaters if they were going to do something a little bit more civilized. But in that same climate, Shakespeare and most of these other playwrights could hardly have flourished without the patronage of their king, and Shakespeare most of all, because he was in the king's company. And so we have to recognize that while so much of art needs to emerge out of the spontaneity of just human desires and human activity, the desire of the artist to make something new, the desire of audiences to see something fascinating, hopefully fascinating in a spiritual and profound way, but in it fascinating nonetheless. Um, that there also has to be a role for stewards of culture. And uh, especially in the United States, where there's a great deal of enthusiasm for the restoration, or at least the return of the extraordinary form, the Latin Mass, um, it's it's uh, it's common for us to be looking back to the documents of the Second Vatican Council, including the very first one to be issued on the Divine Liturgy, for reflection, criticism, and also new understandings. One of the passages in Sacramentum Concilium that I've never heard cited is one that says that the church ought to be an arbiter, a judge of the arts. That is to say, that the church ought to actually play an explicit and direct role in the promotion of things of beauty. It needs to be a promoter of those things within the liturgy, recognizing at all times, of course, that the aesthetics of the liturgy is a truly theological aesthetic. It's not nothing is done just for beauty's sake in the secular sense of those things. It's always done for the sake of the divine beauty, and that should limit and direct what we do, or any changes or alterations that are made to the liturgy in very strict and reverent ways. But also that the church should play a role ad extra outside of the church walls and outside of the specific concerns of ecclesial life in the broader culture. I think I'll refer to once more to Jacques Maritain because in Art and Scholasticism and the Frontiers of Poetry, he has just a wonderful phrase that should be on everybody's lips, which is to civilize is to spiritualize. There is no secular civilization possible, as your great French philosopher Remy Brague once argued. And that's because civilization is intrinsically a spiritual activity. If you see a barbaric civilization, that's a civilization marred and decayed from its aspirations. And so the church should have a specific responsibility to the culture in order to shape the spiritual dimension that is the essential dimension of civilization. I think that has been lost though, and it's been lost in so many ways that it almost feels impossible to talk about. But I'm given consolation by the one thing that you mentioned, which is that Archbishop Cordileone in the Archdiocese of San Francisco in California is one of several American Catholic bishops who have taken very seriously the new promotion of both the liturgical arts, the sacred arts, and also proliferating in the culture new good things. As my mentor Dana Gioia once said, if you don't promote patronage in the broader civilization and within the church, the art you're going to get is TikTok videos. Do you want that to be the legacy of our civilization, or do you want something better? And I think it takes 5 minutes to produce something better. So why are we not doing it?
James Matthew Wilson, would you like to read us a piece from The River of the Immaculate Conception, your great poem published in 2020?
Yes, thank you. So, as I said earlier, this is a poem in 7 parts, and the seventh poem, which is the structure of the poem as a whole, is in part liturgical, and so this is a poem whose title is taken from the final blessing of the Mass of the Americas, and is a poem about the nature of the Mass, the nature of the transcendent, and also the nature of music. Hasten to aid thy fallen people. How does one make a song of holiness, or speak of music without spoiling it? They both seem more than our tongues can confess, and born above in our world do not fit. What's more, those who ascend with them are closed in on themselves, struck dumb, and all in ecstasy that they have heard seems flailing, foolish in a fallen word. But every rising strain must strain indeed to lend a form to what in truth is light, and manifest peace as if it's a deed, and give transcendence some arc of a flight. The purity of every saint will be daubed on with sloppy paint, and what no thought may comprehend or say must be taught in the staging of a play. The gift of form, because so fascinating, as we bend down to work with knife or ruler, reminds us that beyond it's always waiting some piercing light. Consider how the jeweler makes every cut upon a stone for its sake, but not that alone. His patient labor, wasted if a line does not refract and multiply and shine. And any humble instrument may serve to figure forth and yet conceal that light, so that high thought is felt upon each nerve and mystery is given to our sight. Just this way things are lifted up, a chalice wrought from wooden cup, a little dust and water mixed to clay are molded into birds that fly away. The Mass is first his earthen sacrifice, but also taste of peace and heaven's throne, the gift that leaves behind all thought of price, yet where no less we raise a plangent groan, for at its finish we are sent into the world both dark and bent, that bearing out the Virgin's hastening aid, from ruined choirs some good may be remade. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this beautiful reading. And to conclude this interview, maybe would you like to give us some advice for young Catholics who are willing to serve the culture of beauty, which you just demonstrated?
Oh, that's a tough one because one of the lessons I learned from my godmother, whose oldest son commenced on the writing life just about 7 years before I did. There are no straight lines. There are only crooked roads in the paths of every artist, and really indeed of every scholar and intellectual and anybody who aspires to do anything that touches on the things of the spirit. So the things that I can recommend will risk banality because they'll be so primary, they'll be so basic. First of all, it's important to read widely and to encounter the tradition in its fullness in the only way any one of us ever can, which is piecemeal and partially, but uh, tasting of as much as possible, as well as you can, but also not overburdening yourself with the sense of having to master everything before moving on. Sometimes you only need to read 10 pages of a book to get the nourishment it's going to give to you. Sometimes you need to read all 2,000. It just depends on the book, but don't belabor the point. Just read widely. Try to rediscover the great riches of the church, not within any one century, but across the centuries. To read the church fathers prayerfully, but also freely, with a sense of drawing from them what you can, but not confining oneself to anyone. Read also, of course, from classical civilization, as Pope Benedict XVI said more than once. It was no accident. It was undoubtedly providence that led God to spread um, the message of Christ into the heart of the Roman Empire, so that the philosophical language of Greek and Latin could root itself in and make articulate to ever new cultures the great truths of the gospel. So knowing Plato and Aristotle is very important. Knowing your Homer and Horace and Catullus, even vulgar though he is very important to know. The other thing is uh, recognizing the importance of craft. That it is, of course, one of the great modern heresies that art has anything to do with self-expression. The self is only of interest insofar as it participates in something greater than itself, insofar as it's one of the souls that Dionysius the Areopagite said proceed out from the good and return to it in the pattern of the cosmos. And so not only seek to store yourself with the good things of civilization that will transform your soul, but seek to have your soul always be outward looking. To And so when you choose to make something, whether it's a film or a novel or a poem or a piece of music, to recognize that emptying yourself for the sake of the craft and traditions of that art form is absolutely essential. Jacques Maritain said, I'll invoke him one last time today. He said that there's a certain kinship between the sage, the saint, and the artist, and that's because each of these three things are instances of kenosis, of pouring oneself out into reality for the philosopher, into grace for the saint, and into the made stuff of being for the artist. So works of art are not about ourselves, but about the thing that we make. But to make well, we have to master craft. We have to master the traditions of making that our ancestors worked pretty hard to develop if we're going to make anything good ourselves. Finally, just recognize that in this incredibly destabilized age where we really don't know what's going to happen today or tomorrow, and we certainly don't know what's going to happen in the next few years, and where we have good reason in many ways to expect the worst, but also to anticipate new lights in the darkness and new signs of growth and birth. That the track for these things cannot be mundane. It must, as I said at the outset, be crooked. That chances are most of us will not practice the arts that we love as a career, but as an avocation, as something either far to the side of what we're doing with our daily life or just a little bit to the side. And to recognize that that's fine and that's in fact a good and necessary thing because it will allow our contributions to the culture to percolate and proliferate well beyond, say, the confines of the approved literary milieu, well beyond the academy, which, at least in the United States, has done great harm to the life of the arts over the last century. And it will also keep you limber and leave you prepared to do new and good things that you might not otherwise have dared because you don't really owe anything to anyone.
James Matthew Wilson, thank you very much for this wonderful interview. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
My pleasure. It's really great to connect with you, and I hope your French listeners enjoy this.